Cabinet Pro's smart hardware rules, like its smart CNC rules, will, as you are about to see, take all of the work out of figuring out which hardware to assign to your cabinets from job to job. At the Job and Room Information screen, one of the setup files that you should define is your cabinet hardware setup. This is the hardware setup file that will control what hardware and under what conditions will be automatically assigned to your cabinets. Click the Browse button to be taken to a list of your hardware setups. We only have two setup files existing here, but you may add as many as you wish. As in the case of the other screens you have set up in previous levels of this setup curriculum, you may add, edit, or delete hardware setup files. Since we will be using smart hardware rules to determine what hardware will be assigned to our cabinets, make sure you place a check in this box. Now, let's set up our smart hardware rules for our new hardware setup. In fact, for both these setups. Basically, hardware will be assigned to our cabinets automatically if the conditions we define on this screen are met. If they are not met, then the hardware will not be assigned. Once these various setup screens are defined, Cabinet Pro will automatically add the hardware you specify whenever a cabinet meets the conditions for any given rule. If you change hardware setups in the middle of a job, the hardware assigned to all cabinets in that job will change at the same time. Generally, door hinges, door pulls, and drawer guides are already assigned based upon the individual setups for those items you created in a previous level. At this smart hardware screen, we will pre-assign all other hardware and even most of our accessories for those accessories that we want to consider to be hardware. Let's look at a few entries in our standard hardware file. We only have 4 rules in this file, but there is essentially no limit as to how many rules we may have in each setup file. Each of these rules consists of one particular record in the file that we are currently working on, which is, in this case, called standard. For each rule, we have 5 categories to consider. The type of cabinet from our cabinet library this hardware should be assigned to, the conditions under which the hardware should be added, the name of the hardware that comes from our inventory, further conditions that will define how many hardware items should be added based upon what is present, and a multiplier that will be multiplied by however many items are present. If I had a particular cabinet I wanted to assign special hardware to, I could select that cabinet from my cabinet library, or I could simply select all cabinet types, which means that the hardware I'm about to define will be assigned to all cabinets. Next, I will select all conditions because there are no width, height, or depth restrictions. In this column, I will select the hardware item I want, which is, in this case, shelf pins. The number of shelf pins to be added will equal the number of adjustable shelves. If there are no adjustable shelves, then the quantity based upon this condition will be 0. The number of adjustable shelves present will be multiplied whatever number we place here, which in this case is 4. Let's look at another entry. Here, we are saying that for all cabinets, under all conditions, we want to add standard bumpers for each door present, and then we want 2 bumpers per door. Viewing the third entry, we have the same rule as we saw before, except that we are referring to drawer fronts instead. Viewing the last entry, you will notice that this hardware item is really not a piece of hardware. It is an upcharge for an oversized finished end that we placed in our hardware inventory so that we could use automatic upcharges. Here, we are restricting the assignment of this hardware item to only those cabinets whose height is between 50 and 80 inches, and that have finished ends attached to them. Notice that we only want one of these upcharges per finished end. Now that we have finished setting up our our standard hardware file, these rules have already been applied to every cabinet in our job. And since a maximum of 2,500 different cabinets may be attached to a job, hardware will have been added or subtracted to all of them instantly. Let's go look at what hardware has been assigned to our cabinets. Here, we have 2 adjustable shelves and 2 doors, so our smart hardware rules should have assigned 4 door bumpers and 8 shelf pins to this cabinet. Pressing the hardware button, we see that has been done. Now let's add some drawers to this cabinet, change the number of adjustable shelves to 3, and change its height to 60 inches. Since it has a finished end, and one of our rules stated that if a cabinet's height was between 50 and 80 inches, then add an upcharge, so now our hardware should have been automatically adjusted to reflect all of our changes. We now have we now have 12 shelf pins, accounting for 3 adjustable shelves times 4. Here we have the bumpers for our 2 doors, and we have the bumpers for our 3 drawers, which, as a side note, will be consolidated when you produce a bid. And we have our upcharge for our oversized finished end. However many cabinets we have in the job will have changed instantly in the exact same way as our test cabinet just did. Now let's visit the job and room information screen and change our setup to another. We'll change it to what's called JWW Standard, so that we now have that as our hardware file for this particular job. If we revisit our test cabinet again, we'll see that it has not changed, unless we check its hardware, where we see our previous hardware has been replaced by JWW shelf pins and JWW bumpers. Where did this hardware come from? Another way in which we can access our smart hardware rules is via the setup menu, bidding and pricing, and then clicking Smart Hardware Rules. We are now looking at how the JWW standard file is set up in our Smart Hardware screen. We only have 2 rules in our JWW standard file. One involves assigning JWW shelf pins, as we saw that were assigned to our test cabinet, and the other involves assigning JWW bumpers to just doors, as we also saw were present in our test cabinet. As you experiment with Cabinet Pro's smart hardware rules, you will see that the possibilities are pretty extensive.